In March of 2017, The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild was released, heralding a new era of Zelda games, now continued by Tears of the Kingdom, whose philosophy of open-world game design made older Zelda games look obsolete by comparison. For the first time in a long while, the player had the tools almost from the word go to explore and challenge any area or obstacle, allowing for an unprecedented freedom. Critical acclaim and commercial success followed in great quantities. It seemed that Zelda games had evolved to be simply better. But game design is less about finding the one perfect formula and more like deciding between different sets of trade-offs. Yes, the Zelda overworld was better than ever, but what of the dungeons? By forgoing Zelda's usual item-based progression system, Zelda's usual dungeon designs became fundamentally incompatible with the game's design ethos. So instead of traditional dungeons, we got the Divine Beasts, which we won't go into detail about today. Suffice it to say that many found them lacking. Now, in Tears of the Kingdom, Nintendo seems to have sought to address those criticisms with this game's temples. Each of them tried different strategies to craft a Zelda dungeon without betraying the freedom-based design philosophy introduced in Breath of the Wild. The level to which they succeeded varies significantly from temple to temple. In this video, we are going to look at the greatest success among these dungeons, the best temple in Tears of the Kingdom, the Lightning Temple. Before we start analyzing the temple proper, I'd like to take a look at how the scene is set, with the approach to the temple. As you approach the Gerudo Desert, you'll probably notice that things are a bit worse for wear. The old roads, which used to be a highway straight to prosperous Gerudo Town, are now often flooded or blocked off. You may come across the Gerudo Canyon Stable, which is closing entirely due to the damage caused by the upheaval. Enter the desert itself. It won't be long until you're forced to deal with the sand shroud, which makes what Vah Naboris was kicking up in Breath of the Wild look like small potatoes by comparison. Even just getting to Gerudo Town is a battle against nature itself. And when you do, you're faced with what basically looks like a zombie apocalypse. The once proud and mighty Gerudo have been forced to cower underground, while their chief has fled entirely, realizing that in her current state she's too weak to save her people. Enter Link, who helps Riju reach her full potential, before the both of them lead her people in repelling assaults from the Gibdo, twice over, in two of the rare moments where a Zelda game makes you feel like you're participating in a proper battle. Finally, after venturing back into the desert and solving a massive light and mirrors puzzle, the Lightning Temple rises up from the dunes below, and it's time for Link and Riju to delve inside. Now that the scene's been set, let's take a look at the temple itself. I think there are two main reasons the Lightning Temple stands above the other temples in this game. So let me take you through the first as we enter the temple. Riju and Atmosphere. As is the case with all of the temples in Tears of the Kingdom, the Lightning Temple gives you a partner to take on the challenge alongside. This is most likely in furtherance to the game's themes of bonds and the power of friendship, which serves as an interesting parallel to Breath of the Wild's loneliness and isolation, but that's a whole other topic for another day. In this temple, your companion, as you venture through it, is Riju. Personally, I think she's the best of the Sage Companions. This is due in part to subjective factors, like the fact that I think her character arc is more compelling and less heavy-handed than the likes of, say, Sidon and Tullin's, but the way she operates in gameplay plays a significant role as well. The Lightning Temple gives you the feeling of a joint expedition with Riju, whereas the other temples often feel like you're going through it basically alone just with a cool new power-up. I think this is in large part due to how Riju is integrated into the gameplay here. Something this linear gauntlet at the beginning of the temple really highlights, namely the fact that Riju is a mortal being whose safety Link actually has to be concerned about. There are many places in this temple where some sort of trap causes the path ahead to be too dangerous for Riju to follow you down. You then typically have to brave it as Link before somehow neutralizing it for Riju. This makes Riju feel like her own character and not just a power-up for Link, which, just as an aside, this is why I actually support the design decision to make activating Sage abilities done by running up next to them and pressing A. Doing it that way makes you more aware of your whole party you're accruing over the course of the game, instead of them, again, just feeling like power-ups. Oh, and by the way, just a tip if you're really annoyed by that mechanic, if you whistle, it actually calls your whole party to you most of the time. So, if that's ever annoys you, know that. But back to Riju specifically. Another thing that helps her is the fact that she's actually really useful in this temple. Now yes, all the sages are used to basically flip switches in their respective temples. But let's be honest, that generally feels a tad bit arbitrary and token. Riju also does this, but her powers are also super useful for combat in the temple. All the other temples are populated almost exclusively by generic constructs, which are fine opponents, but don't serve the temple thematically or give your sage for that temple a chance to shine. The Lightning Temple, however, has Gibdos, which Riju is very good at helping you deal with, since they're weak to elemental attacks. And for destroying their hives, she's simply second to none. That means that in the Lightning Temple and the lead up to it, I was constantly using Riju's ability, and therefore she cemented herself as a more integral part of the whole endeavor. Now this is probably just me, but it's worth noting that her ability is probably the one I use most often in regular gameplay, likely in large part due to how effectively the Lightning Temple framed it to highlight its use cases. But let's draw back from the gameplay for a second to appreciate the theming and ambience here. I feel like Indiana Jones venturing through this temple. The pacing, especially of the early part of the temple, and having a unique enemy like the Gibdos, helps further cement that. Now, I won't harp too much on theming. I do think the Lightning Temple is also the best in that respect, but I'll also recognize that the Wind Temple and Fire Temple aren't far behind. What I will harp on is the dungeon design. The Lightning Temple can be pretty easily split into two halves. The linear gauntlet at the beginning, and the more puzzle-based second half, centered around the Magic Zonai elevator. The linear gauntlet, as we've already gone over, is great for establishing theme and ambiance, as well as making Riju feel like an actual character. That being said, its overall design isn't that interesting. It's really just a linear series of ordeals. Once you've entered the Room of Ascension, that changes. Now, just like in all of the other temples, your goal now becomes to activate a few switches. Okay, but if this is what they all do, why do I insist that this one does it better? Well, is Zelda Portal? What's the meaning of this nonsensical question? Obviously not. Put the two games side by side and there's almost no similarity. Sure, but Portal is a puzzle game and Zelda dungeons are usually about puzzles. So what is the difference? Well, typically, it's a matter of layout. A game like Portal is focused on bespoke puzzles. You solve a puzzle, which is probably pretty cool and creative, but then you move on to the next one and don't have to worry about that last one ever again. You go A to B to C to D. The defining moment of a Zelda dungeon is the classic you do something and then something happened. Somewhere. The puzzles kind of sprawl on top of each other. You cross a gap to use some bombs to get some keys, which unlock doors that let you cross the gap from another direction, which lets you drop a key down into some water, which you'd die if you tried to get, so instead you go and get a different key, which lets you into a mini-boss fight. Beating him lets you get flippers, which allow you to get that key from earlier, as well as the nightmare key, hidden behind some deep water and a puzzle from earlier in the dungeon. Then with flippers, a key, and the nightmare key, finally, you can face the boss. So instead of A to B to C to D, it's more like A to B to C to back to A, which lets you do something else at C, which finally unlocks D. Or in short, the way I thought about it back in the day when I tried building a Zelda-style dungeon in Minecraft, is that the effect of an action should often be felt in a different area of the dungeon as where the action was taken. So, I flip a switch in one room, and that affects water flows in a different place. Or I get a dungeon item like a bow, or flippers, which recontextualize the rooms and obstacles I've previously been to. Usually this is just sort of how Zelda dungeons work, but 3 of the 5 main dungeons in Tears of the Kingdom flat out don't do this. The Water Temple, Wind Temple, and Construct Factory are all built around self-contained puzzles that you can approach in any order and don't do anything other than partially unlock the dungeon's boss fights. Now, I sympathize with the difficulty of designing dungeons in the old style in Tears of the Kingdom. For starters, you flat out don't have the concept of a dungeon item. The closest you have are the sage abilities, but A, their effects can usually be replicated at least in part through other means, and B, you have them at the start of the dungeon, so they can't recontextualize things halfway through like a dungeon item would. This is true in the Lightning Temple as well, but it does at least have this light mechanic, which allows the designers to reward one for solving a puzzle in one area of the dungeon with a key to unlocking a door elsewhere, which is sort of what the dungeon items were historically meant to do anyway. But speaking of doors, the other main issue Tears of the Kingdom's dungeons tend to struggle contending with is Link's amazing mobility in this game. The fact of the matter is that these sprawling dungeons in the previous Zelda games mostly accomplished their design goals by restricting Link's ability to traverse the dungeon until he'd reach certain milestones. How exactly do you do that when he can climb, glide, and just flat out build all manner of vehicles, including flying machines? This is the question the Fire Temple failed to answer spectacularly. See, here's the thing. This dungeon on paper is actually pretty good. It's all about redirected rails so you can get where you want to in the dungeon successfully. And it was a pretty fun puzzle. In my no jumping or gliding challenge, when I played with the mobility options honestly similar to classic Zelda games, and therefore engaged with the dungeon properly, see, here's the thing. The whole design collapses entirely once you start skipping rooms and gliding around, the way a Tears of the Kingdom player has been conditioned to play the game. But it doesn't have to be this way. The solution is right here in the Lightning Temple. Impassable doors with clearly defined keys. That's what these light statues basically are, and their presence, along with the fact that the Lightning Temple isn't some open-air structure, lets you have the best of both worlds. In any given chamber, you've got the full freedom of Link's moveset, but you can't use that moveset to undermine the structure of the dungeon itself. Conclusion. So, do I hate all of the other Tears of the Kingdom's dungeons? No. But it seems clear to me Nintendo was experimenting here with different approaches to dungeon design in the new Zelda paradigm. And I think, of them all, the Lightning Temple was the most successful experiment. That being said, it still pales in comparison to some of the better dungeons from previous Zelda games, but I think it's a step in the right direction. It certainly came the closest to bringing back the same feeling as older Zelda games' dungeons, without sacrificing the elements that have made Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom special. But that's just my opinion, and I'd love to hear yours in the comments. What is the best dungeon in Tears of the Kingdom, and why? Also, if you'd like to see me take on some Zelda dungeons, you may want to check out my Tears of the Kingdom No Jumping or Gliding challenge, or my Let's Play of Link's Awakening. Additionally, if you want to support the channel, please consider liking the video, subscribing, or even joining my Patreon, like these fine individuals on screen. They got to see this video 24 hours early, and as a special bonus to go along with this video, have been given access to copies of that Minecraft Zelda-style dungeon I mentioned making earlier in the video. I'd especially like to thank my $15 tier patron, Ashford Says. But anyways guys, until next time, I have been CMeeCraft, and I will catch you in the next video. Goodbye.